Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to our, what we hope, our own toddling town, Dr. Thomas Williams.
Okay. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I especially want to single out both Dr. Alcorn and Dr. DeLeo for inviting me to come down here and help with this very impressive reading series. I feel like it's one that I'm glad to be a part of. I also want to thank everyone connected with ABR and the University of Houston, Victoria. And am enjoying my stay here in Victoria, a town that I did not get to see too much in my time in Texas. But I just wanted to say that I recently got married, but prior to that, my girlfriend, fiance then, lived in San Marcos, Texas, and I used to come out from Jonesboro about once a month. And when we moved her stuff back, I remember, getting to Texarkana and thinking, oh no, I'm going to lose Texas again, because I'd left it behind when I was nearing completion at the University of Houston. So any chance to get back to the Lone Star State is one that I relish. So very glad to be here. What I'm going to talk about today, in I hope a less informal fashion, is, the title that we've come up with the talk is The New Delta. And one of the things how I wanted to approach it is primarily from my position as editor of Arkansas Review, which is called a Journal of Delta Studies. And it's an interesting job that I have in many ways, but in particular because it's a journal with a regional focus. In other words, we only publish material that evokes or relates to the natural and or cultural experience of the Mississippi River Delta. And on a day-to-day basis, I feel like I'm confronted with the relevance of a regional journal, especially when you consider how distance seems so relative today, and how globalization seems to be more the current definition of how we see the world. So why does one need to focus on a region? And the last few years, as I've assumed general editorship over the journal, I found that there's a real need, especially for this particular region about which Arkansas Review is focused. But another thing that strikes me is that currently the South, and I know some Texans consider themselves Southern, part of the South, and others think differently, but the South seems to be sort of thriving, especially compared to other regions. My birthplace, the Midwest, and the interior West, and the Pacific Coast, and New England. But sometimes I see the way the South is pictured, especially in popular media, it seems very homogenized and generic. It seems to be, a world of Walmart, Waffle House, NASCAR, and I don't doubt that that's just as much of a kind of empty and uninteresting way of approaching the South as anything that's come before. And I must say that the place where I'm from in Ohio is a very bland suburban wasteland. So anything with color and interest in it catches my eye. But I think that more and more I realize how important Arkansas Review's regional focus is, because there's a history that needs examining in the Mississippi River Delta, and a present that promises an exciting yet unknowable future, and I like to think that we're an important part of the investigation of that. So first, let me just say a few words about the Delta. First of all, it's not a traditional delta. It's not, according to definition, an alluvial triangle-shaped area in the mouth of a river. According to the Delta Regional Authority, It's an 8-state, over 260 county and parish area, linked by proximity to the lower Mississippi River. I imagine St. Louis and New Orleans as the kind of top and bottom of it. Jackson, Mississippi, and Little Rock, Arkansas as the east and west borders. And it is a culturally rich region, which includes southern Illinois, what we call the boot heel of Missouri up in northeast Arkansas, western Tennessee and Kentucky, eastern Arkansas and Louisiana. And what most people think of when they hear the term Delta, the alluvial plain of western Mississippi, the Yazoo River Delta, which according to writer David Cohn begins in the Peabody Hotel in Memphis and ends in Catfish Row in Vicksburg. Oddly, the DRA also, the 8th state of the Delta is Alabama, even though it is nowhere near the Mississippi, but, and there's some western counties and eastern counties of Alabama, which due to specific economic and socioeconomic statistics is included in the DRA because they are, I mean, part of the DRA's focus is invigorating the economy and culture of the Delta. Culturally rich, but also most literally fertile areas in North America, as well as a very poor region. In the blue state and red state debate, the counties and parishes along the lower Mississippi are thoroughly blue. It is one of the most democratic, or as far as a party affiliation, Democratic Party areas in the United States. And furthermore, it is to many the home of the blues, the Delta blues in particular, and also somewhat surprisingly, in an area that has probably proportionately produced and or influenced more U.S. writers of note than any other region. That would include New England or the West. And why that might be can be answered by Delta native Steve Yarborough, the novelist, whom I once asked if he would ever run out of stories to set in the Delta, and he responded, "I find the region limitless." Now, I'm going to primarily concentrate on the state of Mississippi today, but I'd be remiss in overlooking other states. Louisiana is terribly important when we think about the culture of literature, Delta literature, and Delta blues. It's New Orleans writers, people today such as Tom Piazza and Andre Codrescu, as well as John Dufresne, who's actually from Massachusetts, but writes about Monroe, and a newcomer named Olympia Vernon, who has published several recent novels. Baton Rouge, which many people might think of for football, is actually a very, very important home to the swamp pop sound of Excello Records. Some of its most famous artists are Lightnin' Slim, Lazy Lester, and the incomparable Slim Harpo, who's responsible for the song King Bee, which people might recognize, and one of the popularizers of a kind of boogie riff. If my fellow Arkansans heard me emphasizing Mississippi, they'd probably bristle, because we like to think that our Delta is just as important in the blues as well. It's home to, Osceola was home to Sun Seals. Pine Bluff is still the home of Sidell Davis, a person whom I think that everybody would be well served to know, whose music you'd be well served to know. Helena was home to my personal favorite and blues giant, Sonny Boy Williamson II. Howlin' Wolf farmed in Arkansas, and Muddy Waters lived in Blytheville. And the famous King Biscuit Time was broadcast from KFFA in Helena, Arkansas. Still, it's Mississippi that commands much of the attention of scholars and fans, and it's Mississippi Today, which is my focus. And first, I'd like to just consider Mississippi in order to make my case about exactly what this new Delta might be. Okay, so before you know the new Delta, it should be known what the old Delta is or was. Richard Ford calls it the South-South, the Mississippi Delta. And it's also known as, the title of a book by historian James Cobb is The Most Southern Place on Earth. And I think that when you think about blues music and the Delta, if you think about its kind of, not its originators, because it's almost impossible to find somebody who you would call an originator, but a kind of holy trinity, if you will, is Charlie Patton, Son House, and Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson probably being the most famous of them all. Robert Johnson, a particularly elusive fellow who there are right now at least 3 churches around Greenwood, Mississippi, which claim to be his final resting place. Again, they're not inventors of the form, but they certainly established and responsible in recording it. Features of 12 bars, AAB line structure, utilization of bottleneck guitar, along with dazzling showmanship. Patton played behind his head, snapped strings. Robert Johnson, in order to cultivate perhaps the legend that he had sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads, would often play with his back to the audience so nobody could see his satanic fretting. And I think that today still their recordings still sound as remarkable today as they did in the 20s and 30s. Certainly, when I was a high school kid in suburban Columbus, Ohio, I mean, it was just dazzling to hear this stuff. But one of the things I think bears pointing out is what links them is that in order to record, they had to leave the Delta. And that's a pattern which you're going to find among performers and writers, writers from Mississippi, Delta writers as well, that a Delta writer or a Delta bluesman is almost always in exile, which is an interesting sort of feature. Patton and House recorded in Grafton, Wisconsin, about as far away from Mississippi as one could get, as far as miles and culture. And Robert Johnson's famous 29 songs were recorded in Dallas and San Antonio. Now, following them, another holy trinity, if you will, are Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chester Burnett. Muddy Waters' full name was McKinley Morganfield. Howlin' Wolf's name was Chester Burnett, and B.B. King, to name just 3, directly influenced by Patton, House, and Johnson, oftentimes through direct contact. Howlin' Wolf and Charlie Patton knew each other. Son House and Muddy Waters knew each other. And it's important to point out that none of the first generation ever got rich from recording. Patton and Johnson both died young, and Son House was living in Rochester, New York, working as a Pullman car porter when he was rediscovered during the blues revival of the 1960s. Of course, this next generation advances the blues with electricity, and yet one hears very much the same format, similar rhetorical tropes, and by that time smaller labels had come up in the region, Sun Records in Memphis, of course, but also Trumpet, equally important was Trumpet Records in Jackson, Mississippi, which was owned and operated by a white woman. So it allowed local artists to record, but yet, once again, most departed the Delta, most often to Chicago to record for Chess Records. St. Louis in some cases. John Lee Hooker moved to Detroit. And it's worth pointing out right here that Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is at the intersection of highways 49 and 61, is probably responsible for more musicians of that era than any other region, any other city. John Lee Hooker was from there, Muddy Waters from there, any number. And still, Clarksdale, as I'm going to come back to a little bit later, is still a thriving blues scene today, still has that. Those who stayed behind, though, the non-musicians, were likely employed, of course, as tenant farmers, hands for cotton gins. The folklorist William Ferris discovered in his study, Blues from the Delta, that the Delta had changed little over the first 80 years of the 20th century. And much of the musical interaction with the audience, between audiences and performers, took place in what are called juke joints. You can find one of these just about anywhere. Whether it was Robert Johnson in the 30s, Muddy Waters in the 40s, or James' son Thomas in the 60s, Delta blues stayed alive at house parties, fish fries, and juke houses on plantations and former plantations. We have to realize many of the recordings were lost, the original recordings were lost and waiting to be revitalized in the 60s. Mechanization put more hands out of work, though. The Delta saw much of its citizenry depart for northern and southern cities. And it could be said that not too long ago, that blues, particularly the Delta blues, like the novel is often considered to be, like the American middle class is often considered to be, like sometimes a supreme being is considered to be, was, on its last legs, considering it might not be around. Now, quickly to switch just to literature. I always wonder if in a talk like this, if I'm not forcing connections that are there, or if I'm actually seeing these kind of patterns that emerge. But as a person who likes to think in orderly terms, another trinity emerges for literature, and that would be for Delta literature: William Faulkner, Richard Wright, and Eudora Welty. Now, of course, a very different trio here. Important to note that Faulkner and Welty were not Delta residents. Richard Wright was, however, grew up in Natchez, also lived in Arkansas as well for a time. This and this group has sort of come along to see that what they was really more responsible for is presenting the 20th century version, literary version of the Delta. And it's interesting to see how the two hold up against one another, because for the blues singers, blues performers, the Delta is very much a kind of place to get out of. Lack of economic opportunity for one, institutional racism for another. And in the literary version, the version that's sort of crafted by Faulkner, Welty, and Wright, one sees similarities, but it's a slightly different treatment of it. It's a violent place, it's a dreamy place, it's home to wealthy planter families, deprived African Americans, and it's importantly a world where nature seems nothing like a benevolent force. One of the more common threads between the fiction, and that's what I'm usually focusing on, fiction and memoir, the fiction and the blues, is floods. Why? Because here's a statistic that I found related to the 1927 flood. $17 million in relief money paid to over 600,000 people affected by the 1927 flood. Now, compared to, say, modern-day tragedies, that might not sound like a lot of money, but when you consider the small populations of the states affected, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi, and the amount of money, it's staggering. Richard Wright's Down by the Riverside, the Mississippi is as disruptive a force as it is in Charlie Patton's High Water Everywhere, where it is constant, threatening, and it cannot be tamed, and yet crucial to this land to keep it this kind of economic growth. Now, there's a next generation of Delta writers, and if Clarksdale is the birthplace, if you will, of more than its share of musicians, Greenville, Mississippi, is the place where the writers hail from. William Alexander Percy, author of Lanterns on the Levee, and his nephew, Walker Percy, eventually moves to New Orleans. But Shelby Foote, a Greenvillian, Ellen Douglas, another Greenvillian, Ellen Gilchrist, another Greenvillian, Beverly Lowry, another Greenvillian. And this is a generation who found its voice from the 50s to the 70s. But like blues performers before them, tend to be, again, exiles. Shelby Foote moved to Memphis, which, part of the Delta somewhat. It is the capital of the Delta, if you will. Walker Percy moves to New Orleans, and most of the other writers no longer live in Mississippi. Another generation follows them. These writers generally from smaller places in the Delta. Lewis Norden from Itta, Mississippi. Steve Yarborough from Indianola. Willie Morris from Yazoo City. And there's a variety of explanations to account for why these departures. Part of it economic, also part of it educational, that as writers tended to move more toward universities, both as students and instructors there, the Mississippi Delta is not a place that had those institutions for them. So actually one of the universities that profited most from Delta exiles is the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, because it was one of the nearest ones in the region. Okay. But I wanted to share here at this point a kind of dovetailing point between these writers and bluesmen. So much of the time you've got these writers leaving, you've got many of the bluesmen leaving too, but you still have a significant number of performers who stayed behind. But as blues became less popular among African American listeners, these African American artists suddenly had no real outlet, no audience, except for maybe very local ones, and stopped playing. And I've encountered at least 6 or 7 stories, both read about them and also encountered them in interviews I've had with some of these Delta writers, of writers, particularly male writers, encountering, for instance, actually a hill country blues performer named Fred McDowell. The Mississippi writer Jack Butler ran into Fred McDowell when Fred McDowell was washing dishes at a Stuckey's in Como, Mississippi. And Jack Butler and his friends said, you're Fred McDowell, you're Mississippi Fred McDowell. And he said, yeah, I am. And they said, can we hear you play? And he said, well, I stay around here, and if you bring me a bottle of gin, I will play. Steve Yarborough, who I've mentioned before, when he was a young man growing up in Indianola, had some furniture delivered to his house, and he was playing guitar on his porch. And James' son Thomas asked him, do you play? And Steve said yes, and he said, I play a little bit too. And the coincidences of many of these meetings strikes me as one that starts to see where the kind of connection between the literature and the music is that in both literature of the Delta and blues, there's a kind of an authenticity that can't be denied. It's about a place and about a people who've seen a hardship that most don't experience. And yet, one thing that I always wonder about, when especially younger listeners that hear blues for the first time, they think it's sad. They think it's depressing. Why would you talk about all this stuff? Well, you talk about all this stuff because by talking about it and giving it some new sort of form, you get over it. You get past it. One of my favorite blues quotes ever is John Lee Hooker's is, I sing the blues because I'm too damn mean to cry. And this interaction between these writers, these younger writers, and these musicians, I think, starts to really sort of shape a movement away from the Delta as, when seen as literature, as just this place to escape, this place of natural havoc and things, as, a place that worthy of investigation here, a place to stay. All right? So I've been talking about a new Delta. Posters talk about a new Delta, and now I've spent much of my time talking about an old Delta. So what's the new Delta like? Looks a lot the same. You still find it to be largely an agricultural area, but there are now better opportunities for bluesmen. record labels in the area. Malaco Records in Jackson is a very important record label. Not so much for like traditional Delta blues, but a kind of blues soul hybrid typified by artists like Little Milton and Lattimore and Bobby Rush. But also Fat Possum Records in Oxford, which has done much to revitalize the career of, again, hill country blues players like Junior Kimbrough and, drawing a blank. Junior Kimbrough is one, and Sidell Davis is another. Okay. As well, there's more literary opportunities. Oxford American, the literary magazine, used to be housed in Oxford, Mississippi. Now it's housed at Conway, Arkansas. I like to think Arkansas Review plays a part in offering literary opportunities. There are a lot more small independent presses in the South now as well as the University Press of Mississippi. Things. But, and as well, there's also many more MFA programs, both at Memphis, LSU, and Ole Miss, to kind of assure that Delta writers have universities to call home. One thing that just obnoxious point is, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is the Delta is filled with wonderful town names. I mentioned this, it's like I know a fellow at the MFA program at Ole Miss who is from Panther Burn, Mississippi, which is near Nidayuma and Itabena and Tutwiler and all these great places, and they're all still around. Towns still have about like 100, 500 people there, but they're all still there. But the way I see it now is that the new Delta is really the story of two highways, two roads. Many of you are probably familiar with Highway 61. It stretches all the way up to Minnesota from New Orleans. But if you drive south on Highway 61 out of Memphis, and if you were in Memphis, most likely you're on Beale Street, and you went to B.B. King's place, and maybe you bought some John the Conqueror root at Schwab's or something like that. But if you get on Highway 61 and you go down south, in about 20 minutes outside of Memphis, you'll see Tunica. And Tunica is the name of a town, but it's also a metonym for legalized gambling in Mississippi. And why I mention this is because the vista is like this, is that you look over, there's the levee, and there is Harrah's, the Sheraton, Samstown. There's 10 casinos, and these are not just places to, these are not just slot machine places. They have, just some preliminary research showed that Mississippi is now the second largest gaming state in the U.S. after Las Vegas. There's also casinos along the Gulf Coast. But these are places which feature 500-room hotels, music venues, and have revitalized the Delta as a tourist destination and a location where people travel to see. The Mississippi tourism agencies are making a fortune, bringing people in, and it's combined not just with the casino gambling, but to take people on literary tours of the Delta. Blues tours of the Delta are particularly popular. If you remember, I said that Robert Johnson has 3 different graves, so there's a tour in and of itself, just around Greenwood. But this kind of revitalization has brought more tourist dollars, brought more interest to the area. But at the same time, there's Highway 1, Mississippi Highway 1, which hugs closer to the Delta and is home to such towns as Friars Point and Rosedale. And it is safe to say that there are no casinos on Highway 1 and very little tourist activity on Highway 1. And it's in that kind of dichotomy that I think the future of the Mississippi Delta can really be seen. because another thing to take note of is that there are no more juke joints left in the Delta. One of the last famous ones was near Holly Springs, Mississippi, Junior Kimbrough's place, but it's no longer one that's active. The one that I do know of, there's one in Cleveland, Mississippi. It's called Poor Monkeys, and it was recently written up in the New York Times, which is worthy of a talk all in of itself. But so what's happened is that blues performers, if they're going to play, they're going to play Memphis and Tunica. And the likelihood is they're going to play, well, for instance, another example is when Helena, West Helena, used to hold the King Biscuit Blues Festival, this little town in the Arkansas Delta would be visited by people from all over the world, and especially all over the U.S., but all over the world. But meantime, the people living in the Delta who can't get jobs in Tunica because there are only so many, and the gins are shut down, what are they doing? What's happening with them? And so what's going to happen is this homogenized Tunica Delta going to become the real Delta and watch the area around Highway 1 just fade into oblivion? Or is there going to be a way to sort of reinvigorate that area of Mississippi as well? I remain optimistic, and I'm going to share a brief anecdote on why this is. It's that I, of course, go to Tunica, so I can't say like it's a terrible place, nobody should go. But on one of the last trips there, it was November. My wife and I were driving down Highway 61, and we passed a small little area in a former cotton field, which had a hand-painted sign that said, "Pick your own greens, $5." That's the kind of thing the fiction writer looks for every day of his life, because you can't make that up, and you see it, and it's just like it exemplifies everything in one image. Now, I don't like green, so I didn't stop, but what fascinated me was that in the shadow of this corporate, homogeneous culture is this sort of stubborn pocket of resistance. Pick your own greens, all you can, for $5. And that, to me, is where the blues and the Delta blues and literature of the Delta really intersect as well. Is that it's a stubborn body as well, and doesn't go away, and reminds us of these little things, and shows us that there's a need to remember, and there's a need to look forward as well, and to not get caught up in the kind of glitz and flash that one can easily have when sort of confronted by, this sort of edifice, the mammoth quality of the Delta. And I think it's going to always have its problems, but I think it's also going to be home to more writers. One continues to see more and more musicians, particularly young African Americans, who are returning to blues and going to create this new sound, a sound that's going to strike us probably with the same vibrancy and excitement that the Delta blues did in the 20s, and a new literature that's going to strike us with the same sort of poignancy and importance of that by Richard Wright, that by William Faulkner, that by Steve Yarborough, that by Beverly Lowry. So, as I said, I remain confident and I remain optimistic, because this is a region which has been counted out countless times and still continues to come back. And I encourage everybody who is not familiar with the writers and artists of this wonderful region to start to do so, because you'll be in for a treat, and it'll be something that you'll probably not, like most of us who get hooked by it, you'll not be able to shake. So I thank you for listening. And that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you all for coming out. If you have any questions, we might have time for one or two questions. Anybody?
That's a good question. I guess because I don't want to sound flippant and say because I'm good at it or something like that, but I'll say honestly that I, like a lot of the writers I know, I mean, kind of struck out at other things. I'm not never going to be a good musician. I never was going to make much progress behind a certain point as an athlete. I'm an impatient scholar. I don't really like to spend a whole lot of time in scholarly pursuits. But the one thing that I do find that gives me a great amount of pleasure every time that I come back to it, because sometimes with other obligations, I don't get a chance to write as much as I like. I mean, I edit a journal that comes out 3 times a year, and as much as I like to do that, it takes away from my writing time. But I find that it is something that whenever I come back to, it embraces me with as much affection as I do it, and I find myself thinking that I still have so much, more to write about. It's endless. I mean, I think that all the other pursuits that I pursued were ones that were going to have a place where I ran out of interest, ran out of time, ran out of talent, maybe. But this one is one that constantly amazes me and reinforces that I, may not have made, my mom and dad don't think I made the wisest decision, but I think I did. So, yes, ma'am.
Have you always loved to write?
Probably. I mean, I think that it creates some tension in that I know what I want to do and know what I'm accomplishing on the page. So in an answer to that, yes, I always have, but there are certain periods where, TV does look really interesting and much more fun. Yes?
Well, it seems to me in the 1950s and 60s, when blues music converged with styles of like folk,
Mm-hmm.
with Bob Dylan, and when popular music picked it up and became rock and roll with like Elvis,
Mm-hmm.
that the old bluesmen became kind of stereotypical and almost like archetypes for America.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think when that happened, the blues lost a voice and a sincerity, or do you think that was just an evolution?
Well, I mean, it's probably a little bit of both. I think that one of the things that Chess Records tried mightily to keep its artists current, and some of the most unfortunate recordings are from the '60s, like Muddy Waters' Blues Twist, and they always tried to bring English musicians in with artists to record new versions of things. But I think that it did trigger an evolution, because the more country blues players, even electric players who are more country, started to become more the darlings of white rock audiences, and the more soulful city blues artists like B.B. King and Bobby Blue Bland retained a more devoted African American audience. So that does trigger the two, but you're starting to see that those two strains or strands of blues are kind of coming back together again. So it's a good question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. And I'm thoroughly impressed by their efforts. I think especially their efforts to rebuild the city are Herculean and need our support as much as we can. My only question sometimes, and I worry about this about blues too, is a kind of need to sort of return so much to the roots that it almost sort of shuts down invention and renewal of things. And I think that those two are guys who just are doing the work of keeping things alive for another generation who, without them, might not hear about this stuff. Yeah, yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's I think that's the dilemma is, and I think they come down on a side of it, which I'm fully behind, and but I'm also somebody who wants to hear what that next generation is going to do as well. Yeah. Yes, they're in the back.
Did Erskine Caldwell fit into this group? And if so, how important or unimportant was he?
Well, in a bigger picture, Caldwell is more responsible for a kind of like part of just a Southern literature in general. And I mean, he was far more popular than Faulkner, Wright, and Welty combined as well. But I mean, regionally, he's a little bit outside of the Delta, and yeah, I see him in just more in that Southern Renaissance, but not so much as a Delta writer. Yeah, it's still important though. Yes.
In relation to rap music, it's such a mainstream thing nowadays.
Yeah.
Do you see any connection, or even lack thereof connection, with the blues in relation to the rap?
Memphis is a really interesting place for that. Memphis and Little Rock, Arkansas, where you're seeing this kind of not so much a cross-pollination between blues and rap, but certainly rap artists have a little bit more of a nod toward the past there than maybe some like East Coast and West Coast guys. And the thing that to me is always kind of fascinating about rap is that I mean it in some ways became a kind of new blues in that it was the authentic voice of a people, and it was speaking more to people, but it soon also became kind of commodified and part of and which shows just how good it was, that people were eager to make a buck off of it. But I don't that address kind of.
I was trying to see the relationship, like you said, it goes back to the roots of,
Yeah.
of your voice coming out from your area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I think is interesting about a lot of these Memphis rappers who are coming from a place which was in that sort of first wave of rap and hip hop was just overlooked. I mean, nobody cared about Memphis or Little Rock and places like that. So they're answering in a new way. There's one more. Yes.
What kind of advice would you give to an aspiring writer?
Did anybody say don't do it?
Not yet, you might do.
The main advice is learn two things: discipline and patience. The discipline, it's a job that the only person who makes you do it is you, and it's very easy to feel like oh, I'm hanging out at a coffee shop or a coffee house gathering material when you're not really doing that. So getting up every day, writing a little bit every day. I try to write, if I'm working on something, about 3 pages a day, which doesn't sound like much, and when I was younger would have sounded like a really measly output, but when you add it up over a month, that's 90 pages. 6 months, that's 180. My math skills are really stunning. But so discipline, but patience as well, because a lot of times it's very easy to see other people, like somebody gets published, somebody and they send out a story and it gets published, and right away you want that too, You know, because that seems to be the only validation you can have of your choice. And it doesn't come to everybody at the same time. So learning patience, which is patience in becoming successful, but learning patience in learning how to like let a story show you how to write it rather than to force your way through it. I think that those are two things that, you know, if I keep them up on the kind of like 3x5 cards above my desk, it's like, you know, be patient and come back to the desk every day. I think that's the kind of advice that, you know, that I wished I would have heard a little bit earlier. So, just patience.
Very good. Well, thanks again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And thank you all for braving the bad weather and coming out. We really
Indeed.
appreciate it. We hope to
Yeah.
see you back on February 28th.
Yep.